Well, when I was a little girl, I loved to hear stories about my parents' childhood, and I would beg them to retell the same stories over and over again. And one story that I particularly liked was a story from my dad's childhood when he was probably early to mid elementary school. And the story goes like this. He was born in the early 50s, and so back in the 50s, apparently kids were given something called juice money, which they were to take to school and give to their teachers to contribute to the juice fund for snack time. And so his mom gave him his juice money one day, and he walked to school, and for whatever reason, he forgot to give his juice money to his teacher. And on the walk home, and yes, he was walking by himself from the neighborhood school to his house, which in this day and age would be crazy, but I think that was pretty par for the course in the 1950s. And on his way home, he decided that that juice money was burning a hole in his pocket, and instead of saving it for the next day to give to his teacher, he was gonna sneakily go to the corner store and buy some secret candy. And so he did. He went to the corner store, he stocked up on some penny candy, and then he strategically hid it somehow on his body. And on his walk home, he decided, how am I gonna hide this so my mom doesn't see it? So he decided that he was gonna hide it in his backyard, kind of behind the fence, so his mom couldn't see that he had purchased this candy. So he did it, and then he came inside and did his thing for the rest of the afternoon, homework, playing, and didn't say a word. Nobody said a word. And then at dinner time, he sat down at his spot for the family dinner, and all of that candy had been laid out on his plate instead of the dinner, which everybody else in the family was eating. And he looked down, and he knew, of course, immediately that he had been caught. And his mom looked at him and said, well, instead of dinner tonight, you're gonna go to your room for the rest of the night. No dinner for you. And of course, she threw the candy away. And as a kid, I loved this story because there's nothing quite like hearing stories about your parents and your grandparents of when they were naughty, and even more importantly, of when they were naughty and got caught. And so this was a story that I asked to hear on repeat. Now I have 2 kids, they like to hear this story on repeat. And certainly there's also stories about my mom, their grandma, they like to hear too. But I think there's something for us about hearing stories of the generations past that just really binds us to one another. And we are people that have been made to appreciate stories. Maybe it's because it helps appeal to our imaginations. It helps appeal to our own humanity. I also think that there's something that's important about stories in terms of teaching. That when we hear a story, maybe it cements it in a way that is different than if we were just to hear the facts about something. Well, today we are going to be talking about several different stories that Moses either talks about or alludes to in our passage from Deuteronomy 6. And so as you know, if you've been following along, that we are in a series right now called Moving into New Territory. And that's because as a culture and as a church, we're sort of in this in-between land right now, aren't we? Where we're still in COVID times, but we can kind of see that there's a light at the end of the tunnel. We're moving forward, and we need to prepare for the new things that God is going to have for us as we move on into this next phase of our journey. And that's exactly where the Israelites are in the book of Deuteronomy. They have been delivered from slavery, they have gone through the wilderness, and now Moses is preparing them to take the next important step into the promised land, the land filled with milk and honey, as it says in Scripture. And he's preparing them to be able to step into that fully and really know God in that process. Well, the last few weeks we have been in Deuteronomy 6, and today we'll wrap that chapter up. And the thrust of Deuteronomy 6, the central part of it, Michael has preached about already. It's called the Shema. It's the love the Lord your God. It's that chunk. Michael referred to it as the Israelite Pledge of Allegiance. And we see today in our passage later after that, Moses kind of backing that up and continuing to teach on that. And so join me now. We're going to be starting in verse 10 of Deuteronomy 6. When the Lord your God brings you into the land he swore to your fathers, to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, to give you a land with large flourishing cities you did not build, houses filled with all kinds of good things that you did not provide, wells you did not dig, and vineyards and olive groves you did not plant. Then you will eat and be satisfied. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord, who brought you out of Egypt, out of the land of slavery. So here in this section of scripture, Moses starts off with the first set of stories that he begins to teach the people with. So, of course, the first one is he's reminding them of the past story of their ancestors, and that the promised land is something that has been promised to them for a long time. So they will know that story well, and they can summon back to that. The second story is a new part of the story that they're heading into, and it's the story of the bounty of the promised land. And so as we think about where the Israelites are at, I think it's important for us to remember that they are a group of people that are nomads, that they have never really set their roots down in a way where they are free. They've either been in slavery or they've been wandering around, led by God and being provided for, but nonetheless nomads. And now they have an opportunity to move into a place where they can really put their roots down deep and enjoy all the things that come with that. But the trick to that is that it isn't as if they're moving into an open land that's never been built on before. They are actually going to be taking over towns and countrysides that are already flourishing in lots of ways. It reminds me of 6 years ago, we bought a house, and the house that we purchased is in a neighborhood, and it's a little bit unique because it has probably about 10 fruit trees. There's pear trees, there's apple trees, there's Asian pear, all kinds of fruit trees. And when we purchased the house 6 years ago, we actually purchased it from the original owner. It was a man in his 90s who had planted those fruit trees, had tended them the second half of his adult life, and they're just really incredible trees. They produce a lot of fruit every year. And so when we moved in that first summer and fall, we were amazed because we had hardly done anything, but yet we had this bountiful harvest. And that was the summer that we started canning applesauce. So now my husband and my son work together, and they make huge amounts of applesauce for us to enjoy for several months after the harvest is through. And to me, that is just a picture of just a small picture of what it would be like for these Israelites, that they didn't plant those trees or nurture them, but they were able to enjoy the harvest. And we know, I think as people, as part of the human condition, that when we are in times like that, where there is so much flourishing and so much bounty, that it's easy to get a little bit too caught up in some of those good gifts. And that brings us to our next point. At the very end, Moses says, this is verse 12. He says, be careful that you do not forget the Lord. Be careful that you do not forget the Lord. And I really like the imagery that he uses there, because if you look back into the Hebrew, it's actually watch for forgetfulness. And I just imagine it as like being on a watchtower, or I like to sometimes just stand in my front window and look out my window and just kind of watch the neighborhood. And that's the image that I have, is that we are to be, in times of prosperity, and really all the time, we are to be looking out, to be watchful for little areas where we might be prone to forgetting God. And I think what's insinuated here is that it isn't just a all of a sudden thing, that it seeps out little bit by bit in terms of our forgetfulness towards God. All right, well, as we move on from talking about watching for forgetfulness, I'm going to bring us next to verse 13. So let's start with verse 13. Fear the Lord your God, serve him only, and take your oaths in his name. Do not follow other gods, the gods of the people around you. For the Lord your God is among you, and he is a jealous God, and his anger will burn against you, and he will destroy you from the face of the land. Well, several years ago, I was volunteering as a person in charge of a children's department for a Christian ministry. And one of the things that we talked a lot about in our training and in our preparations was something that we called setting the limits. And it's very simple. All it meant was that when you're teaching kids, or really in life at all, it's important to remember what are we doing, what can we expect in terms of the activity and the plan, and what are the expectations for us as we move forward in the world. So I think that this is essentially what Moses is doing here, and we see it throughout Deuteronomy, that he is setting the limits, that he is showing what's expected, what the people can expect from God. And we see that with God's covenant, that he is saying that he can expect him to be faithful to him and to love them. But also there's a certain set of expectations that he has for them. And so we see that here in this passage of scripture as he talks about fearing the Lord, serving him, having no other gods, that those are some of the expectations that he has given them. And really those expectations are out of a place of life and wanting them to prosper and flourish. And so I wanted to share this quote with you. It's a quote from Tom Wright, who's a theologian, and I think it does a really good job fleshing out as we look at this passage of scripture that does talk about the consequences that God has for us. It helps us understand that. So this is how Tom Wright puts it. When God looks at sin, what he sees is what a violin maker would see if the player were to use his lovely creation as a tennis racket. But here is the difference. In many expressions of pagan religion, the humans have to try to pacify the angry deity. But that's not how it happens in Israel's scriptures. The biblical promises of redemption have to do with God himself acting because of his unchanging, unshakable love for his people. And so I just love that picture of how Tom Wright puts it, that God has given us these promises, and they have to do with our own redemption and his own plan of love for us. And as I was thinking about this word forgetfulness and these consequences that God has given the people in terms of forgetfulness, I hearkened back to so many of the stories from the Old Testament, specifically in terms of the major and the minor prophets. It really specifically brought me back to the book of Hosea. And really it's a story of how God's people had forgotten God and some of the consequences that come from that. But perhaps the rose in the desert, the thing that comes out of all of those prophetic words from the Old Testament, is the promise of the Messiah. And that even though the people have forgotten God, that God has never forgotten his people, and he has planned for redemption all along. Well, as we move forward here in verse 16, we're going to hear about another story that Moses reminds the people of, and this is the story going backwards. So join me in verse 16. Do not put the Lord your God to the test, as you did at Massah. Be sure to keep the commands of the Lord your God and the stipulations and decrees he has given you. Do what is right and good in the Lord's sight, so that it may go well with you, and you may go in and take over the good land the Lord has promised on oath to your ancestors, thrusting out all of your enemies before you, as the Lord said. Well, so here in this little chunk, Moses refers to the story of Massah, and I don't think he goes into it because I think the people know the story well. And I'll just take you back. It's Exodus 17. And the history before Exodus 17 is that God's people have fled out of Egypt. They have crossed over through the Red Sea by the mighty hand of God. And then most recently, God has done a daily miracle by providing them with quail and manna every day. And so this is what's been going on for them. They're, nomadically traveling. God keeps moving them. And at this place, God has moved them. And he's moved them in stages. And they set up camp. And I like this. This is from the Message, Eugene Peterson's words. He says, there wasn't a drop of water for the people to drink. The people took Moses to task. Give us water to drink. But Moses said, why do you pester me? Why are you testing God? And as you continue to read the story, you see that God in his grace provides them with water. But I'm going to go back here, or go forward to Psalm 95, because I think it provides a lot of clarity about what does it mean for them to test God. So it says, this is Psalm 95, verse 8 through 9. It says, do not harden your hearts as you did at Meribah, as you did that day at Massah in the wilderness, where your ancestors tested me. They tried me, though they had seen what I did. And so I think that last verse really provides the key for us to understand what happened at Massah and why Moses, specifically in Deuteronomy 6, might be guarding them against that. That there was a sense that the people had seen already that God loved them, that God had provided for them in miraculous ways. He had demonstrated his love in freeing them from slavery. And yet, as God moves them, and they know that he is with them, they continue to test him. And I think of testing as they don't put their trust in him, that there's a sense of whining and complaining, and not really coming to God in relationship, but just kind of complaining behind the scenes. And I think that it's a missed opportunity for them, that they could have been in relationship with God and seen God provide through that give and take. But instead they had to rely on God to show them grace in a different way. So here's another cool thing about the story of Massah, that we see it show up in another really important way. And that way is when Jesus is being tested in the wilderness. So another aspect of testing, right? And this time it's Jesus. And specifically what happens is that Satan comes and tests Jesus. For the third temptation, Satan says to Jesus, "If you are the Son of God, throw yourself down from here." And Jesus responds by citing this very verse that Moses gives the people, where he says, "Do not put the Lord your God to the test." And so what I see happening here, and why I think Jesus used this particular piece of scripture, is that Jesus, before he was tempted in the wilderness, had this encounter with God where he knew who he was to God, that he knew that he was God's son, that he knew his identity, and he didn't have to put that to the test because he was aware of it and he was secure in it. And that's how Jesus is using this piece of scripture. And I think that's the same invitation that we have as we look at this piece of scripture, is that we have an invitation to trust God and to put our hope in him and to trust that he loves us and that he wants a relationship with us. Well, as Moses refers to Massah, he continues on, and he goes on to this next section where he talks about their relationship with the younger generation, and it's basically an invitation to tell the story of God. So join me in reading verse 20, the rest of the chapter. It says, "In the future, when your son asks you, 'What is the meaning of the stipulations and decrees and laws the Lord our God has commanded you?' tell him, 'We were slaves of Pharaoh in Egypt, but the Lord brought us out of Egypt with a mighty hand. Before your eyes the Lord sent signs and wonders, great and terrible, on Egypt and Pharaoh and his whole household. But he brought us out from there to bring us in and give us the land he promised on oath to our ancestors. The Lord commanded us to obey all these decrees and to fear the Lord our God, so that we might always prosper and be kept alive, as is the case today. And if we are careful to obey all of this law before the Lord our God, as he has commanded us, that will be our righteousness." So we see here Moses is continuing to talk about, this is a theme, their role with the younger generation. And we do continue to see that Moses is emphasizing the law as a gracious gift to the people, that it's a way that they can see what's expected of them. I also think it's important that we realize that one of the other primary reasons God gave the law is it really points to our grace, the grace that we need, the grace of God that we need in our lives. Because we all know, if we're self-aware at all, that we mess up on a regular basis and we can't perfectly fulfill any of the commandments, but Jesus did, and it points towards our need for him. So the law is a gracious gift for us and for the people, for those reasons. And the other thing I really like about this chunk of scripture is that I think it points towards the reality that as our kids get older, they start to ask questions. And so I have two very inquisitive children who are amazing, and they are often asking my husband and I questions about why we live our lives the way that we do, why maybe we're sometimes different not always, but often different from their peers or from the people around them. And it spurs us on to really good questions about what does it mean for us to live for Jesus in our family? And what is the story that God has done in our lives and has done in our family? And I think that that is what Moses is inviting this generation into, is not just people that lay down the law, although there is obviously, as we talked about, a time and a place for that. But I think he is also inviting these people, the Israelites, and this is also true for us, to tell a story of God. Where do we see God's handprints on our life, and how can we pass on those stories of God's faithfulness, of his provision, of his kindness, of his grace? How can we pass those stories down to those younger than us? And I think as we begin to tell those stories and they're personal, those words come alive to our kids and to our grandkids, and they start to see that following Jesus isn't just about checking the boxes or following the rules, but it's about having a living relationship with Jesus Christ. And as they hear that story, it really cements deep in them. I think it captivates their hearts and their imaginations, and it points towards our children and our grandchildren realizing, oh, this is something that I want to be part of. And maybe the God that provided so mightily for my grandpa could also do the very thing that I need. Well, we are in a place right now of transition in terms of our storytelling as a culture, right? We are still in it, the COVID time, but we are beginning to kind of see the light at the end of the tunnel. And I think it's a good time for us as a culture to start thinking about what would it look like for us to start tell some of our COVID stories. And certainly we're going to have lots of opportunities in the years to come to talk about the crazy year that we've had. And for some of us, the COVID time has been really hard. There have been huge amounts of loss and loneliness and just lots of things that are really tough. Some of us have had it a little bit easier. But I would encourage us, just as the Israelites got to share the mighty story of God, of pulling them out of slavery and bringing them into the promised land, to be thinking about how during COVID times have you seen that same character of God at work in your life? How have you seen God's grace? How have you seen him show up through his people? How can you include the character of God in your COVID story as you pass it along to friends and to family members? I think that as we think about that and just begin to practice telling those stories, that it will equip us for the years to come, just to continue to see our lives through the lens of, God, what are you doing? Where are you at work? Well, as we wrap up this morning, I have 3 questions for you. The first one is, where are you prone to forgetfulness? So remember we talked about that. The Israelites were warned against being prone to forgetfulness. So where are you prone to forgetfulness? Number 2, where are you tempted to test God rather than to trust God? So just as the Israelites were tempted to test God at Massa and here going into the promised land, where does that apply to you? And my last question is, what part of God's character and work in your life could you include in your COVID times story? How could you honor God and weave him into the things that you have seen happen in the last year in a way that just brings alive the truth of the gospel to the people around you?